What if I told you that one of the greatest armies in history didn't lose Stalingrad on the battlefield? They lost it in their own minds before a single shot was fired? A frozen city of ashes, where soldiers vanished into rubble, where pride replaced strategy, and where winter itself became a weapon. This is not just another war story. This is the moment an empire began to collapse. In the next minutes, you will see how a battle that looked like victory turned into a slow, merciless nightmare, and why Stalingrad was doomed from the very start. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. The wind over the Volga carried more than dust and smoke. It carried whispers of death, echoes of shattered dreams, and the cries of men who knew, deep in their bones, that they were walking toward an abyss. In the summer of 1942, as the sun burned over the steppe like an unblinking eye, the German army marched toward Stalingrad with the confidence of conquerors. To them, this was just another city, another name to be crossed off on the map of their domination. But Stalingrad was not just a city, it was a symbol, a nerve center, a wound that would bleed the Wehrmacht dry. From the very beginning, this battle was doomed. It was doomed the moment Hitler decided that pride mattered more than strategy. Instead of crushing Soviet forces and securing the Volga with calculated precision, he became obsessed with the city that bore Stalin's name. Stalingrad was no longer a military objective. It became a personal vendetta, a political trophy, a psychological battlefield where logic was sacrificed on the altar of ego. As German divisions pushed forward, they stretched themselves thinner and thinner across the endless Russian landscape. Their supply lines grew fragile like threads in a storm. Fuel ran low. Food ran out. Winter loomed like a silent executioner on the horizon. And still the order came, take Stalingrad, at all costs. But inside the city, something else was awakening. The Soviet defenders were not just soldiers. They were factory workers, students, mothers, sons, and fathers who had nowhere left to retreat. Behind them was the Volga. Behind them was their homeland. Behind them was annihilation. Stalingrad was reduced to rubble by relentless German air raids. Buildings collapsed into dust. Streets turned into graveyards. Smoke blackened the sky until daylight itself seemed to vanish. Yet within that ruin, resistance hardened like steel. Every shattered wall became a fortress. Every basement became a bunker. Every broken window became a sniper's nest. The Germans expected a swift victory. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare. House-to-house combat turned the city into a labyrinth of death. Soldiers fought at point-blank range. Knives replaced bullets. Grenades flew through shattered stairwells. Men died inches apart, staring into each other's eyes in their final moments. This was not war anymore. This was madness. And still, the German high command refused to adapt. They pushed deeper into the city, bleeding men and resources in a battle they could never truly win. Their troops were exhausted, frostbitten, and haunted by the realization that Stalingrad was swallowing them alive. Then came winter. The temperature plummeted to unbearable lows. Weapons froze. Engines stalled. Men perished not just from bullets, but from the cold that seeped into their bones like a slow poison. Meanwhile, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted, trapped in a frozen hell, cut off from supplies, surrounded by relentless Soviet forces. The German soldiers in Stalingrad were left to starve, freeze, and die. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The Battle of Stalingrad had been doomed from the start. Not because the Germans lacked strength, but because they underestimated the human spirit. They underestimated the will of a nation that refused to kneel. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was a breaking point, a turning tide, a testament to the price of hubris. And when the last German soldiers surrendered in February 1943, their defeat echoed far beyond the ruins of the city. It echoed across Europe, across the world, through history itself. Because Stalingrad proved one eternal truth. In war, armies may conquer land, but only the unbreakable will of people can decide destiny, and that is why Stalingrad was doomed from the very beginning. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad did not begin as madness. It began as calculation slowly curdling into fixation. In the summer of 1942, the German war machine was still riding the momentum of its earlier victories, its columns stretching across the Eastern Front like a relentless steel tide. Operation Blue had been designed with cold military logic: drive south, seize the Caucasus oil fields, cripple the Soviet Union's ability to fuel its armies, and secure Germany's economic future in the war. Stalingrad, in this original plan, was never meant to be the heart of the campaign. It was a supporting objective, a flank to be secured, a transport hub to be neutralized, not a prize to be fought over to the last man. Yet as the campaign unfolded, something shifted inside Hitler's mind, subtle at first, then overwhelming, as if the name of the city itself began to exert a gravitational pull he could not resist. Stalingrad carried a symbolic weight that no map could quantify. It bore the name of his greatest ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin, the man he despised with an almost personal venom. To Hitler, capturing Stalingrad was not merely about logistics or strategy anymore. It was about humiliation, about proving the supremacy of his vision, about striking at the very identity of Soviet resistance. What began as a military objective slowly transformed into a psychological duel between two dictators, fought not in private chambers but across ruined streets, bombed factories and shattered neighborhoods filled with terrified civilians and exhausted soldiers. This shift in mindset altered the entire trajectory of the campaign, bending rational planning to the will of one man's pride. As German forces advanced toward the Volga, Hitler grew increasingly impatient with his generals, many of whom cautioned against becoming too deeply entangled in urban combat. They warned him that city fighting would bog down their armored divisions, strain their supply lines, and give the Soviets every advantage in a defensive battle. Experienced officers like Halder and later Paulus understood that the true objective lay beyond Stalingrad, in the oil-rich south, and that diverting too many resources to a single city could prove disastrous. But Hitler, sitting far from the front in his headquarters, increasingly dismissed their concerns. He saw hesitation as weakness, caution as defeatism, and advice as a challenge to his authority. Each report of Soviet resistance in Stalingrad seemed to harden his resolve rather than temper it. His decision-making became erratic, shaped more by ideology than battlefield reality. Instead of allowing his armies to encircle the city and move on, he ordered them to take it street by street, building by building, no matter the cost. He believed that the mere presence of the Wehrmacht in Stalingrad would shatter Soviet morale, that the city would fall quickly once its symbolic heart was pierced. This assumption underestimated not only Soviet determination, but also the brutal nature of urban warfare, which devours manpower, time, and momentum. German divisions that could have been maneuvering freely across open terrain found themselves grinding forward in narrow corridors of rubble, exposed to snipers, ambushes, and counterattacks from every direction. Hitler's obsession also led him to split his forces at critical moments, weakening his own position. In his desire to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously, he diverted troops and resources that could have secured his flanks, leaving them dangerously vulnerable. While the Sixth Army pushed deeper into Stalingrad, Weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units were tasked with holding vast stretches of the Don River to the north and south. These Allied forces were poorly equipped, undertrained, and ill-prepared for the ferocity of Soviet counterattacks. Yet Hitler brushed aside warnings about their fragility, convinced that sheer German willpower would compensate for any strategic risk. Within the command structure, tension mounted as reality clashed with Hitler's vision. Field Marshal Paulus, tasked with leading the assault on Stalingrad, found himself trapped between his duty as a soldier and the impossible demands of his Führer. He knew that the city was becoming a meat grinder, that every meter gained cost an unbearable number of lives, but he also understood that disobeying Hitler was unthinkable. Orders flowed from Berlin that grew more rigid and less connected to the situation on the ground. Flexibility disappeared, replaced by absolute directives that left little room for tactical adaptation. The battle became less about defeating the enemy and more about fulfilling Hitler's personal desire to claim Stalingrad as a trophy. As the fighting intensified, Hitler's fixation only deepened. Reports of Soviet resilience seemed to infuriate him, feeding a cycle of escalation rather than restraint. Instead of adjusting his strategy, he doubled down, committing more troops, more artillery, more air power, as if sheer destruction could bend reality to his will. The city was pulverized into dust, its factories reduced to skeletal frames, its residential districts turned into landscapes of twisted metal and broken concrete. Yet beneath this devastation, Soviet resistance did not collapse. It adapted, using the ruins as cover, turning every pile of debris into a defensive advantage. Meanwhile, the psychological dimension of Hitler's obsession began to infect the entire German war effort. Propaganda framed Stalingrad as a decisive struggle, a battle that would determine the fate of the Eastern Front. This narrative boxed the Wehrmacht into a corner, making retreat or strategic wit politically impossible. To admit that Stalingrad was a mistake would have been to admit that Hitler's judgment was flawed, something his regime could not allow. Thus, thousands of soldiers were condemned to fight not only for military objectives, but for the ego of a dictator who refused to acknowledge his own miscalculations. Inside the encirclement that would eventually form, the consequences of this obsession became painfully clear. German troops found themselves cut off, low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, all because their leader had prioritized a symbolic victory over practical survival. Luftwaffe attempts to resupply the trapped Sixth Army by air proved woefully inadequate. Yet Hitler insisted that relief was possible, that the situation could still be salvaged through sheer determination. His belief bordered on delusion, disconnected from the freezing reality on the ground where men were starving, freezing, and dying in their thousands. In many ways, Hitler's fixation on Stalingrad reflected a broader pattern in his leadership, a growing tendency to see war as an extension of his will rather than a complex interaction of forces beyond his control. Where earlier campaigns had succeeded through speed, coordination, and adaptability, Stalingrad became a test of stubbornness, a contest between ideology and logistics, between pride and practicality. The city was no longer just a battlefield, it was a mirror reflecting the fatal flaws of Hitler's command. As the battle dragged on, even some of his most loyal commanders began to recognize that Stalingrad had become a trap of his own making, yet fear of his wrath silenced open dissent. Meetings in the Führer's headquarters grew more tense, with Hitler increasingly isolated in his convictions, surrounded by subordinates who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The war, once driven by strategic calculation, was now being steered by a single man's obsession with a name, a city, and a rival he could never personally confront on the battlefield. The German advance towards Stalingrad in 1942 was built on speed, momentum, and the illusion that distance could be conquered as easily as armies. In the early months of Operation Blue, the Wehrmacht rolled across the southern Soviet Union with a confidence born from previous victories, their armored columns slicing through the steppe like blades through cloth. Yet beneath this appearance of unstoppable power lay a growing vulnerability that few outside the highest command fully grasped. Every kilometer gained pulled the German war machine farther from its logistical foundation, stretching its arteries of supply thinner and thinner until they were on the verge of snapping. The problem was not immediately visible on the battlefield, but it was present in every fuel truck that struggled along dusty roads, every stalled train stuck behind damaged rail lines, and every soldier who waited anxiously for food, ammunition, tea on, or winter clothing that might never arrive. The vastness of the Eastern Front was unlike anything the German military had encountered in Western Europe. In France, Belgium, or Poland, infrastructure had been relatively intact, distances manageable, and supply routes shorter. In southern Russia, the land seemed endless, an ocean of grass and sky that swallowed roads whole and turned movement into a constant battle against terrain and distance. As Army Group South pushed deeper toward the Volga and the Caucasus, its logistical network became increasingly fragile. Rail lines, which formed the backbone of German supply efforts, were either damaged, incomplete, or operating far below capacity due to partisan sabotage and Soviet scorched earth tactics. Each delay rippled through the entire campaign, slowing reinforcements, limiting fuel deliveries, and creating shortages that steadily eroded the Army's fighting strength. Fuel, the lifeblood of modern warfare, became one of the most critical weaknesses. German armored divisions, which had achieved so much through rapid maneuver in earlier campaigns, now found themselves rationing their movements, conserving precious gasoline for moments deemed absolutely necessary. Tank crews often sat idle, not because they lacked targets, but because their engines could not be risked without certainty that more fuel was on the way. Supply convoys stretched for miles behind the front lines, vulnerable to air attack, mechanical breakdown, and the simple exhaustion of drivers who had been on the road for weeks. Every time a panzer division advanced, it did so knowing that its supply tether was growing longer and more precarious. Ammunition shortages crept in more gradually, but with equally devastating consequences. The grinding urban combat in and around Stalingrad consumed shells at a rate far beyond what planners had anticipated. Artillery barrages that might have been routine in other theaters became luxuries that had to be carefully rationed. German infantry often found themselves advancing with limited fire support, forced to rely on small arms and grenades in brutal close-quarters fighting. The promise of overwhelming firepower that had defined the Blitzkrieg began to fade, replaced by a war of attrition that the Wehrmacht was ill-prepared to sustain so far from its industrial base. Food and medical supplies were another weak link in the chain. As the front moved farther east, feeding and caring for hundreds of thousands of soldiers became an increasingly complex challenge. Supply depots lagged behind, and local resources were scarce or deliberately destroyed by retreating Soviet forces. Soldiers at the front often went hungry or subsisted on meager rations, their physical strength slowly draining away. Wounded men faced grim prospects as field hospitals struggled with shortages of medicine, bandages, and transport. The human cost of overstretched logistics was felt not only in battle casualties, but in the quiet suffering of men worn down by hunger, disease, and fatigue. The dependence on rail transport proved to be a critical flaw. Unlike the Soviets, who operated on a broader gauge rail system that they could adapt and repair quickly, the Germans had to convert captured tracks to their own standard. a slow and labor-intensive process. This created bottlenecks that delayed the movement of troops and supplies at crucial moments. Trains loaded with ammunition or fuel could sit idle for days while engineers worked to make the tracks usable, all while the front demanded immediate support. These delays compounded over time, creating a growing gap between what the German army needed and what it could realistically receive. Allied Axis forces, tasked with protecting the flanks of the German Sixth Army, further exposed the dangers of overstretch. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops were positioned along vast stretches of the Don River, but they lacked the heavy equipment, anti-tank weapons, and logistical support that German units enjoyed. Their supply situation was even more precarious, dependent on a system already struggling to meet the needs of the Wehrmacht itself. When the Soviet counteroffensive eventually struck, these thinly held lines crumbled not only because of superior enemy strength, but because they had been left vulnerable by a supply network stretched beyond its breaking point. Communication breakdowns added another layer of chaos. As distances grew, coordinating between different army groups, divisions, and support units became increasingly difficult. Radio transmissions were unreliable. Messengers faced long and dangerous journeys, and critical information often arrived too late to influence decisions. Commanders in the field struggled to adapt to rapidly changing conditions because they were operating with incomplete or outdated logistical data. This disconnection between strategy and reality widened as the battle for Stalingrad intensified. Winter, when it came, revealed the full extent of the logistical catastrophe. German supply planners had underestimated the severity of the Russian cold, and preparations were woefully inadequate. Winter clothing and equipment arrived slowly, if at all, leaving soldiers exposed to temperatures that could freeze metal and flesh alike. Weapons malfunctioned, vehicles stalled, and men perished, not just from enemy fire, but from frostbite and exposure. The overstretched supply lines, already strained to their limit, proved incapable of meeting the sudden and overwhelming demands of winter warfare. Within Stalingrad itself, the situation grew increasingly dire as the city turned into a battlefield. Supplies had to be funneled through narrow corridors under constant fire, making resupply missions perilous and often unsuccessful. German units found themselves fighting with dwindling ammunition, patching together makeshift defenses, while knowing that reinforcements might never arrive. The sense of isolation deepened as each day passed, a psychological burden that compounded the physical hardships imposed by logistical failure. Even the Luftwaffe, tasked with providing aerial resupply after the encirclement of the Sixth Army, was hamstrung by the same systemic weaknesses. Limited transport capacity, harsh weather, and relentless Soviet anti-aircraft fire meant that only a fraction of the required supplies could be delivered by air. Planes that did make it through often arrived with only token amounts of food or ammunition, a cruel reminder of how far reality had diverged from Hitler's promises of relief. The overstretched supply network, now stretched beyond any possibility of repair, left tens of thousands of German soldiers trapped in a slow-motion disaster. Behind all of this lay a deeper strategic flaw. The German war economy was not equipped to sustain such an expansive campaign on multiple fronts simultaneously. Factories at home struggled to keep pace with demand, while resources were divided between the Eastern Front, North Africa, and occupied Europe. Every shell, every gallon of fuel, every pair of boots had to be produced, transported, and distributed across an ever-expanding war zone. As Stalingrad became the focal point of Hitler's obsession, other areas were stripped of support, further weakening the overall war effort. The overstretched supply lines thus became more than just a logistical problem. They symbolized the limits of German power in the face of the vast Soviet landscape and industrial capacity. What had once seemed like a demonstration of military brilliance slowly revealed itself as a campaign built on assumptions that could not withstand reality. Each broken-down truck, each delayed train, each empty ammunition crate told the same story of an army that had advanced farther than its lifelines could sustain. Urban warfare in Stalingrad did not resemble the battles the German army had perfected earlier in the war. It was not a war of sweeping tank maneuvers, rapid encirclements, or decisive breakthroughs. Instead, it was a slow, grinding descent into chaos where time, morale, and human endurance mattered more than strategy on a map. From the moment German troops crossed into the shattered outskirts of the city, they entered a battlefield that devoured strength in ways no military doctrine had prepared them for. Every street became a front line, every building a potential death trap, and every advance a costly gamble that eroded the Wehrmacht's power far more than any open field battle ever had. At first, the Germans believed their overwhelming firepower would simply crush the defenders beneath the weight of artillery and air bombardment. Stalingrad was subjected to one of the most intense aerial assaults of the war. Entire districts reduced to smoking ruins before ground troops even set foot inside. From the sky, the city looked like a lifeless wasteland, a broken skeleton of concrete and twisted metal. But this devastation, rather than weakening Soviet resistance, transformed the city into a perfect defensive landscape. Rubble created cover. Collapsed buildings formed natural fortifications, and shattered streets limited the movement of German tanks and vehicles. What the Luftwaffe destroyed, the Red Army turned into advantage. For German infantry, the transition from open warfare to urban combat was a brutal shock. Soldiers trained for coordinated advances found themselves isolated in narrow corridors, stairwells, and basements, where traditional tactics offered little protection. Fighting became intensely personal, often taking place at distances so close that men could hear each other breathe. Rooms were cleared inch by inch. Floors fought over separately, and entire buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. The rhythm of battle no longer followed the movement of divisions or regiments, but the deadly pulse of individual skirmishes in shattered apartments and burned-out factories. Snipers turned Stalingrad into a city of invisible death. From cracked windows, piles of debris, and hidden positions within the ruins, Soviet marksmen picked off German soldiers with terrifying precision. No movement was safe, no open space free from the possibility of a sudden, fatal shot. German troops learned to fear not just what they could see, but what they could not. The psychological toll of this constant, unseen threat wore them down far beyond physical exhaustion. Men hesitated, flinched, and grew increasingly paranoid, their nerves fraying as the days dragged on. Close quarters combat stripped away any illusion of glory in war. Grenades became the most common weapon, tossed through doorways or down stairwells with deadly effect. Explosions filled enclosed spaces with shrapnel, dust, and fire, leaving survivors disoriented and terrified. Bayonets and knives were used in desperate struggles where reloading a rifle took too long. In these moments, war ceased to be an abstract conflict between armies and became a visceral fight for survival between individuals trapped in collapsing structures. German armored units, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, found themselves increasingly ineffective in the ruined city. Tanks that had dominated the open fields of Europe struggled to maneuver through narrow streets clogged with debris. Their thin side and rear armor made them vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank teams who waited in ambush with Molotov cocktails, explosives, and anti-tank rifles. Every time a panzer rolled forward, it risked becoming a burning wreck, trapping its crew inside a metal coffin. As losses mounted, German commanders grew more hesitant to deploy their remaining armored strength, further limiting their tactical options. Factories along the Volga became some of the most fiercely contested battlegrounds in the city. Places like the Red October steel plant, the Barrikady factory, and the tractor factory turned into industrial fortresses where Ting raged day and night. Inside these vast complexes, combat took on a surreal character. Soldiers battled among conveyor belts, furnaces, and towering machinery, their silhouettes flickering in the glow of fires and muzzle flashes. The Germans might seize one section of a factory, only to be driven back hours later by a determined Soviet counterattack. Control of space became fluid, constantly shifting in a cycle of advance and retreat that bled both sides dry. The relentless pace of urban combat exhausted German troops in ways that traditional battles never had. There was no clear front line, no safe rear area where soldiers could rest without fear of sudden attack. Even supply routes within the city were under constant fire, making every resupply mission a dangerous ordeal. Sleep became scarce, nerves remained on edge, and the line between day and night blurred under the constant thunder of artillery and small arms fire. Over time, this unrelenting pressure degraded unit cohesion, discipline, and combat effectiveness. Casualties mounted at a terrifying rate. For every building captured, dozens of German soldiers were killed or wounded. Medics struggled to treat the injured amid collapsing structures and ongoing firefights, often forced to work in makeshift shelters with limited supplies. Evacuating the wounded from the front lines was perilous, exposing stretcher bearers to sniper fire and shelling. As losses increased, experienced veterans were gradually replaced by less trained reinforcements who were even less prepared for the horrors of Stalingrad's urban battlefield. The psychological impact of the fighting was as devastating as the physical destruction. Many German soldiers began to lose their sense of purpose as the battle dragged on with no clear end in sight. What had once been framed as a decisive campaign now felt like a senseless slaughter. Letters home grew darker, filled with descriptions of endless ruins, constant danger, and the haunting presence of death. Some men broke under the strain, their mental health collapsing in the face of relentless terror and exhaustion. Meanwhile, Soviet defenders drew strength from the very brutality of the battle. They fought with a fierce determination rooted in the knowledge that retreat was not an option. The closer the fighting came, the more it neutralized Germany's technological and organizational advantages. In the rubble of Stalingrad, individual courage, local knowledge, and sheer resilience mattered more than armored superiority or air dominance. Every Soviet soldier who held a single room or street corner contributed to draining German strength bit by bit. As weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect of urban warfare became impossible to ignore. German divisions that had entered Stalingrad full of confidence were reduced to shadows of their former selves. Their manpower dwindled, their equipment wore down, and their morale steadily deteriorated. What had been intended as a swift victory over a key city transformed into a protracted nightmare that consumed resources and lives at an unsustainable rate. The nature of the battle also disrupted German command and control. Coordinating operations in such a fragmented environment proved incredibly difficult. Units became isolated from one another, communication lines were frequently cut, and orders often arrived too late to be effective. Commanders struggled to maintain a coherent strategy when their forces were scattered across countless small engagements within the labyrinth of ruins. This disorganization further amplified the draining effect of urban combat on German strength. Artillery, once a decisive tool of German warfare, became both a blessing and a curse. While it could demolish enemy positions, it also destroyed the very terrain the Germans needed to advance through. Each bombardment turned more of the city into impassable rubble, creating new obstacles for their own troops. Additionally, the constant shelling contributed to the mental exhaustion of soldiers who lived under an unending barrage of noise and destruction. By the time winter approached, the German army inside Stalingrad was already critically weakened, not just by the enemy, but by the nature of the battlefield itself. The brutal urban fighting had stripped away its momentum, shattered its confidence, and bled its ranks dry. What remained was a force trapped in a shattered city, worn down by months of relentless combat that had slowly but inevitably drained its strength to the breaking point. Soviet determination in Stalingrad was not born in a moment of glory. It was forged slowly in fear, loss, and a relentless refusal to surrender even when everything around them seemed to be collapsing. When the German armies first approached the city in the summer of 1942, Stalingrad was already wounded, scarred by months of war and looming disaster. Civilians packed train stations and riverbanks, desperate to escape across the Volga, while others stayed behind because they had nowhere to go or refused to abandon their homes. The Red Army soldiers arriving to defend the city did so knowing that this was not just another battlefield, it was a last stand, a line that if broken would open the heart of the Soviet Union to destruction. From the very beginning, the defenders of Stalingrad understood that survival would depend not on technology or superior numbers, but on sheer willpower. The city was bombed relentlessly by the Luftwaffe, turning neighborhoods into piles of rubble, factories into burning skeletons, and streets into landscapes of dust and ash. Many soldiers and civilians were buried under collapsing buildings, yet those who survived did not retreat. Instead, they adapted, learning to move through the ruins like ghosts, using destruction as both shield and weapon. What the Germans saw as devastation, the Soviets transformed into a network of hidden defenses. Discipline within the Soviet ranks was harsh, often brutal, but it reflected the gravity of the situation. Orders like "not one step back" echoed through the city, a chilling reminder that retreat was not an option. Some soldiers who attempted to flee were stopped by blocking detachments, but more often, men and women chose to stand and fight because they understood what defeat would mean. Stalingrad was more than a strategic location. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience, and that belief gave them strength even when hope seemed thin. Factories along the Volga became more than industrial sites. They turned into battle sanctuaries where workers fought alongside soldiers. Many civilians who could have fled instead took up arms, forming militias or assisting in defense efforts. Women served as nurses, snipers, radio operators, and even frontline fighters, defying traditional roles and proving that determination was not limited by gender. Their presence hardened the resolve of the Red Army, reminding them that they were not just fighting for territory, but for their families and way of life. Soviet commanders, particularly General Vasily Chuikov, recognized that conventional tactics would fail in a ruined city dominated by close-quarters combat. Instead of trying to hold broad front lines, they focused on smaller, highly mobile units that could fight building by building, room by room. This approach played directly into their strengths, as Soviet soldiers were often more familiar with urban environments and willing to endure extreme hardship. They dug tunnels through basements, created hidden passages between buildings, and established defensive strongpoints that were nearly impossible for the Germans to fully eliminate. Snipers became one of the most powerful expressions of Soviet determination. Men like Vasily Zaitsev turned the shattered city into a hunting ground, patiently waiting for hours to take a single decisive shot. Their success was not just tactical, but psychological, instilling fear in German troops who realized that any careless movement could be their last. Each German soldier killed by a sniper reinforced the idea that Stalingrad itself was fighting back, that the city had become alive with resistance. The Volga River played a crucial role in sustaining Soviet determination. Despite constant German artillery and air attacks, boats continued to ferry reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies across the water under the cover of darkness. Many of these crossings were suicidal missions, with countless men dying before even reaching the shore, but still the boats kept coming. The sight of fresh troops arriving gave hope to exhausted defenders, proving that they were not abandoned and that the Soviet command had not given up on the city. Within the ruins, Soviet soldiers developed an almost instinctive sense of survival. They learned to sleep in short bursts, to move silently through debris, and to fight with whatever weapons were available. Molotov cocktails, improvised explosives, and captured German weapons became tools of resistance. Even when outgunned or surrounded, they found ways to resist, turning every building into a potential trap for advancing German forces. Morale, despite unimaginable suffering, remained remarkably strong. Many soldiers were driven by a deep hatred of the invading forces, fueled by reports of German atrocities in occupied territories. Stories of villages burned, civilians executed, and prisoners mistreated spread among the ranks, reinforcing the belief that surrender was not an option. To many defenders, Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was a fight for survival against an enemy they believed would show no mercy. Leadership within the Soviet ranks also played a critical role in maintaining determination. Commanders often led from the front, sharing the same dangers as their men. Zhukov, in particular, earned the respect of his soldiers by staying close to the fighting, visiting frontline positions, and understanding the realities of urban combat. This created a sense of unity and trust that strengthened their collective resolve. As the battle dragged on for weeks and then months, the defenders of Stalingrad grew increasingly battle-hardened. They learned the rhythms of German attacks, identified weaknesses in their tactics, and adapted accordingly. Each small victory, whether holding a single building or repelling an assault, reinforced their belief that they could withstand the German onslaught. The city, though shattered, became a fortress not because of walls, but because of the unyielding spirit of those who defended it. Civilians who remained in the city contributed to this fortress-like resilience. Many worked tirelessly to support the military effort, repairing weapons, preparing food, or tending to the wounded. Their presence reminded soldiers that they were fighting for real people, not just abstract ideals. This connection between army and populace blurred the line between battlefield and home, making the defense of Stalingrad a deeply personal struggle for everyone involved. The Soviet ability to endure suffering became one of their greatest strengths. While German troops struggled with exhaustion, supply shortages, and the psychological toll of urban combat, Soviet defenders seemed to draw energy from hardship. They had already endured years of war, invasion, and loss, and Stalingrad became another crucible in which their resolve was tested and tempered. Coordination between different branches of the Soviet military also improved over time. Artillery, infantry, and engineers worked together more effectively, using the terrain to their advantage. Soviet artillery positioned across the Volga provided crucial support, targeting German positions within the city and disrupting their advances. This cooperation strengthened the defensive network, making it increasingly difficult for German forces to achieve decisive breakthroughs. The determination of the defenders ALSO had a powerful symbolic impact beyond Stalingrad itself. News of their resistance spread across the Soviet Union, inspiring others to continue fighting on other fronts. The battle became a rallying point for national unity, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Soviet people could stand their ground. As winter approached, Soviet morale remained unbroken, while German strength steadily waned. The defenders of Stalingrad, hardened by months of brutal combat, were prepared not just to survive, but to turn the tide. Their resilience transformed the ruined city into something far more formidable than any concrete fortress, a living stronghold built on courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable refusal to yield. The winter that descended upon Stalingrad did not arrive gently. It came like a slow, inescapable executioner, tightening its grip on every soldier, every weapon, and every illusion of German invincibility. As autumn faded, the sky over the Volga turned gray and heavy, and the first icy winds began to sweep across the steppe, carrying with them a cold that seeped into bones, metal, and morale alike. For the German Sixth Army, already battered by months of brutal urban combat, the changing season was not just another hardship. It was the final force that would expose the full fragility of their position. They had entered Russia unprepared for such conditions, confident that victory would come before the frost, and now winter loomed as an unforgiving reminder of that fatal miscalculation. The temperature dropped steadily, transforming the battlefield into a frozen wasteland where breath turned to mist and steel grew brittle. Weapons that had once functioned reliably began to malfunction. Machine guns jammed, rifle bolts froze, and artillery pieces became sluggish and unreliable. Soldiers struggled simply to move, their fingers numb inside inadequate gloves, their faces raw and cracked from the biting wind. Frostbite became as deadly as bullets, claiming men who had survived months of combat only to fall victim to the cold. The ground hardened into a frozen shell, making it nearly impossible to dig proper trenches or bury the dead, leaving bodies exposed in the snow like silent witnesses to the catastrophe unfolding. German vehicles, already strained by overstretched supply lines, suffered tremendously in the freezing conditions. Engines refused to start, lubricants thickened into useless sludge, and fuel lines cracked under the extreme cold. Tanks that had once dominated open battlefields now sat immobilized, their crews trapped inside metal shells that offered little protection from the elements. Supply trucks stalled along icy roads, unable to deliver desperately needed food, ammunition, and medical supplies. What little resupply reached the front often arrived too late or in insufficient quantities, deepening the sense of isolation among the troops trapped in and around Stalingrad. Inside the encircled city, conditions grew increasingly desperate. German soldiers huddled in ruined buildings, trying to stay warm beside small fires that barely pierced the freezing air. Rations dwindled to meager scraps, and men began to starve as much as they froze. Hunger weakened their bodies, making them even more vulnerable to illness and exposure. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded and frostbitten soldiers, but medical supplies were scarce, and many men died not from their injuries but from untreated infections or sheer exhaustion. The psychological toll of this slow deterioration weighed heavily on the Sixth Army, eroding their will to fight even as orders demanded they hold their positions at all costs. Meanwhile, beyond the ruined streets of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union had been preparing a decisive counterstroke. While German forces were fixated on capturing the city itself, Soviet commanders quietly assembled their strength along the vulnerable flanks of the Sixth Army. Operation Uranus was conceived not as a direct assault on Stalingrad, but as a strategic masterpiece designed to exploit the weaknesses created by German overreach. Vast numbers of Soviet troops, tanks, and artillery were secretly massed to the north and south of the city, positioned to strike at the thinly held lines defended by Romanian and other Axis allied forces. When Operation Uranus was launched in November 1942, it struck with the force of a hammer. Soviet artillery thundered across the frozen steppe, shattering the already fragile defenses of the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies. Tanks and infantry surged forward through the snow, overwhelming positions that lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons or experienced manpower. The Axis lines crumbled with astonishing speed, their soldiers retreating in confusion and panic as Soviet forces tore through their ranks. What had once seemed like secure flanks for the German Sixth Army dissolved in a matter of days, revealing the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's decision to rely on poorly equipped allies to hold such critical positions. As Soviet forces advanced from both north and south, their pincers closed around Stalingrad with terrifying precision. German commanders watched in disbelief as reports flooded in of collapsing defenses, lost positions, and entire units being overrun. Within days, the trap was complete, and the Sixth Army found itself encircled by a massive Soviet force that cut off all land routes of escape or resupply. The realization of their predicament spread through the German ranks like a chilling wave, transforming fear into something deeper and more paralyzing. Hitler's response to the encirclement only deepened the disaster. Instead of authorizing a breakout attempt while the Soviet ring was still forming, he ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast, declaring Staling at a fortress that must be held at all costs. He assured his generals that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped troops by air, a promise that proved hopelessly unrealistic given the harsh winter conditions and limited transport capacity. Planes that attempted to reach the encircled forces faced intense anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures in the cold, and poor visibility, resulting in heavy losses and minimal delivery of supplies. Inside the encirclement, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Daily airlifts provided only a fraction of what the Sixth Army needed to survive, let alone continue fighting effectively. Soldiers grew weaker by the day, surviving on meager rations of bread and horse meat when it was available. Morale plummeted as hope of relief faded, replaced by a grim acceptance that they had been abandoned in a frozen hell. Some men clung to the belief that a German relief force would arrive, but as weeks passed, that hope grew increasingly hollow. Soviet forces, meanwhile, tightened their grip, gradually shrinking the pocket around Stalingrad through relentless attacks. Their troops, better prepared for winter warfare, pressed forward with determination, using artillery and armored units to break through weakened German positions. Each Soviet advance pushed the trapped Sixth Army into an ever smaller area, compressing their lines and increasing the intensity of combat. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad became the stage for the final act of a tragedy that had been years in the making. Operation Uranus did more than just encircle the German Sixth Army. It shattered the myth of German invincibility on the Eastern Front. For the first time, the Wehrmacht faced a decisive, large-scale defeat that could not be explained away as a tactical setback. News of the encirclement sent shockwaves through Germany and its allies, undermining confidence in Hitler's leadership and emboldening resistance movements across occupied Europe. The battle that had begun as a quest for symbolic and strategic victory had turned into a humiliating catastrophe. Attempts to break the encirclement from the outside, such as Operation Winterstorm, led by Field Marshal Manstein, ultimately failed. Although German relief forces fought their way within striking distance of Stalingrad, they were unable to penetrate the Soviet defenses or coordinate effectively with the trapped Sixth Army. The combination of harsh winter, determined Soviet resistance, and the logistical nightmare facing any rescue effort doomed these attempts from the start. Each failed offensive further sealed the fate of the soldiers trapped inside the pocket. As January 1943 arrived, the end became inevitable. German resistance inside Stalingrad grew increasingly fragmented, with units surrendering or collapsing under the combined weight of hunger, cold, and relentless Soviet pressure. Field Marshal Paulus, promoted by Hitler in a final desperate gesture meant to prevent his surrender, ultimately had no choice but to capitulate. The freezing winter that had crippled his army and the encircling forces of Operation Uranus had left him with no alternatives. For the German soldiers who survived to surrender, the ordeal was far from over. Many were taken as prisoners of war, forced to march through the snow in brutal conditions that claimed countless lives. Those who remained behind lay buried beneath the frozen ruins. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.